And with that, it's my privilege and pleasure to invite the Vice-Chancellor and Warden, Professor Karen O'Brien, to formally introduce the speaker. Thank you very much.
Good evening, and welcome to this, the fourth and last of Durham University's global lectures in the current series. I'm delighted and honoured to be able to welcome you all to this evening's event here in the magnificent premises of the Institution of Civil Engineers. And the warmest of welcomes to all of you who are joining us online. I understand it's currently 140 people, so there are many of us here, David, to listen to your lecture. The issue we will be considering is one which would have struck a chord with the redoubtable engineers who founded the institution 205 years ago. They had the confidence and wealth to construct this building at the dawn of the Victorian age. They lived like us in a world dominated by science. It was the age of new technologies such as railways, steamships, the electric telegraph, and mass circulation newspapers. It was a time of rapid industrialization and urbanization. It was also the era of Charles Darwin, a subject of one of David's books, and Karl Marx, and of scientific questioning of religious belief systems. The relationship between science and religion mattered to the Victorians, and it matters to us now. We find ourselves too pondering big philosophical questions. Are gaining spiritual wisdom and understanding the physical universe complementary or contradictory endeavours? We are immensely fortunate to have with us this evening someone who has thought long and hard about such questions. David Wilkinson is a Fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society, having conducted research in theoretical astrophysics. He is also a Methodist minister. He is Professor in Durham's Department of Theology and Religion and has written numerous books on subjects like extraterrestrial life and Christian eschatology and science. And he's also the principal of one of our colleges, St. John's College. His perspective is extraordinary and perhaps unique. David is not just an observer of the interaction of science and religion, he is an active contributor to the dialogue between the two. His talk will, I know, be a fitting culmination of a lecture series that has already enabled us to think about the extinction and survival of communities, species, and the very universe itself. This evening, we can round off this intellectual journey by reflecting on the interplay of ideas at the boundary, if boundary it is, between religion and science. So David's going to speak for about 45 minutes, and he's very kindly agreed to respond to the points raised in a question and answer session which will follow. And for those of you who are joining us online, please post your questions in the Zoom chat function, and we'll try to ask as many of them as we possibly can. David, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice-Chancellor, and thank you for those of you here in the room and those of you who are joining online. It's very kind of you to be here. And what a privilege it is to be part of this series with Professor Frank and Professor Hudson and Professor Harper. And on extinction of species, I'm going to just stray slightly off my topic and go back to extinction of species. You'll see why a little later on. But one of the things that I worked as a physicist on was the death of the dinosaurs, and particularly why we see other mass extinctions within the terrestrial record. And around the time that I was working with Arnold Wolfendale, very distinguished professor of physics at Durham, there were a number of people who were saying that if you look at the terrestrial record, there is a cyclicity of about 30 million years in mass extinctions. The dinosaurs weren't the only one. And interestingly enough, people said, if you look at the way that the solar system moves around our Milky Way galaxy, it oscillates up and below the plane of the galaxy every 30 million years or so. So people said, maybe something happens when the solar system moves through the plane of the galaxy, which is the concentration of stars and gas in the Milky Way. And perhaps as it oscillates through the vast cloud of comets on the edges of our solar system called the Oort cloud, are bumped into by big molecular gas clouds or other stars. And so every time the solar system moves through, you get comets coming into the inner solar system, they impact the Earth, and you get a mass extinction. The trouble was that, having done a bit of work with Wolf and Dale and Mark Bailey, we tended to show, and I think we showed reasonably well, that in fact there's just not enough stars or molecular gas clouds in the plane of the galaxy to make that happen. You can't distort the Oort cloud enough every time it moves through to cause a mass extinction. Now, Professor Harper might have talked about other reasons for mass extinction, so I'm not going to get into that. But my reason for telling you this, and you may be going, what on earth is he on about, is the very important thing that we need to notice, and that is that correlation does not imply causation. And there are many naive ways of looking at the decline in religious adherence and linking it to the growth of science. This is the data, of course, from the recent Office of National Statistics surveys saying that the UK is not a majority Christian. I mean, anyone who goes to church on a Sunday morning knows that. We've known that for quite a long time. But this way of simply saying science is the reason, the cause for the decline in religion, doesn't quite work. Things are much more complicated than that. And as you probably see at the bottom of that plot, the rising numbers of other faiths just is a caution for us to be careful about as we try and talk about this. So in terms of the real lecture, that was just a mini lecture to start off with. In terms of the real lecture, what I'm going to suggest, first of all, is that there are those who have argued both for and argued that it needs to be the extinction of religious belief by science. And we'll look briefly at the phenomenon of new atheism and the secularization hypothesis. Then I'm going to suggest to you that in fact, we've seen, in fact, the more than survival of religious belief within a science-dominated world. And then if we get through that, I'll talk a little bit about some of the areas where I think there's a fruitful dialogue between science and theology. I hope that sounds all right. I'm a great fan of the Big Bang Theory. I mean, not just the model of the early universe, but also the American television comedy. And in the Big Bang Theory, the young physicist Sheldon is often put in conflict with his mother, who is a Baptist six-day creationist from Texas. And the spin-off series of the Big Bang Theory, Young Sheldon, talks about how this young physicist grew up in six-day creationist Texas. And there in six-day creationist Texas, young Sheldon forms a relationship with Pastor Jeff, the local church minister. This is the first time that Sheldon encounters Pastor Jeff.
Sometimes people say to me, Pastor Jeff, how do you know there's a God? And I say it's simple math. God either exists or he doesn't. So let's be cynical. Worst case scenario, there's a 50-50 chance. And I like those odds.
That's wrong.
Shelley, put your hand down. Sorry, please continue.
It's okay, Mary. It's Sheldon, right?
Yes, sir.
Well, Sheldon, why don't you come on up here and tell me how I'm wrong?
No.
Okay.
Let's give him a hand, everybody.
What's happening?
Shelley's going to eat him alive.
So, you were saying?
You've confused possibilities with probabilities. According to your analogy, when I go home, I might find $1 million on my bed, or I might not. In what universe is that 50-50?
So what do you think the odds are that God exists?
I think there's zero. I believe in science.
So you don't think science and religion can go hand in hand?
Science is facts. Religion is faith. I prefer facts.
I understand that. Here's a cool fact for you. A lot of famous scientists believed in God. Isaac Newton, Albert Einstein, even Charles Darwin.
So Darwin's right about God and wrong about evolution?
Now you're getting it. Let's give it up for Sheldon, everybody. What a good sport. Oh.
But I wasn't a good sport. At that moment, I vowed to come back the following Sunday and destroy Pastor Jeff.
In the question time, you're very welcome to destroy the speaker tonight, by the way. But the Big Bang Theory in popular culture, of course, reflects often some of the deeper philosophical understandings. And this sense that religion will be destroyed by science has been very prevalent within Western culture. It found its high point, perhaps, in the rise and peaking of new atheism. These are the four horsemen of the apocalypse, as they were sometimes referred to: Richard Dawkins, Dan Dennett, Sam Harris, and Chris Hitchens. And science undergirded their attack to say that not only was religion wrong, but it was also potentially evil and bad. They were reflecting particularly after 9/11, and they pursued an agenda which has now been picked up within popular culture, although the new atheists themselves may not be as popular today as they were. If you go to stand-up routines by Ricky Gervais or Stephen Fry, you'll see very much the new atheist arguments reappearing. Slightly more subtle was Peter Berger in 1968 in an interview with the New York Times, where he talked about, in the 21st century, religious believers are likely to be found only in small sects, huddled together to resist a worldwide secular culture. And he talked about the pervasive influence of science in bringing that about. This argument that science and technology leads to an inevitable decline in religion has become one of the popular myths, I guess, in the West. And if you look at some of the scholarship in this area, on the right is Steve Bruce, not the former Newcastle United manager, but sociologist from Aberdeen University. God is Dead, Secularization in the West. The argument is that as science and technology becomes more and more dominant within a culture, so religious belief declines. Not only a number of academics found this, but also it was something right at the heart of Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek. Roddenberry believed that on the bridge of the Starship Enterprise, united by science, religion was no longer needed. And so in the original series of Star Trek, religion very rarely appears. When Rick Berman took over the Star Trek franchise into Deep Space Nine and Voyager and some of the Star Trek movies, you begin to see religion just appearing again. Roddenberry didn't like this at all and fell out by saying, in a world of science in the future, religion would not exist. The problem, however, is that the secularization itself, secularization hypothesis or model, doesn't work. And Peter Berger himself, after 20 years or so, came to see this and argue for it. And it seems to me there are a number of problems with the secularization hypothesis. The first is the dominance of the conflict model at the heart of it, which we know doesn't quite make sense. The conflict model, once I've got a scientific understanding of something, that's all I need. I don't need anything else. Comes, in fact, only from about 150 years ago. It came as a result of a London dining club, the X Club. In fact, they could be called the X-Men, because in those days, London dining clubs only had men. And headed by Thomas Henry Huxley, a number of leading scientists of the day met and talked about a major problem that they had in modern science. And the major problem, with respect to one or two of you here, was the Church of England. The problem of the Church of England was that the Church of England had political control over professional science. So in order to be professor of astronomy at Durham University in 1842, you had to be an ordained Anglican clergyman. It would help if you were a bishop to be president of the British Association of Science. Huxley and others wanted to move the political control of science outside of the sponsorship patronage of the church. And one of their strategies was to introduce the conflict model between science and religion. Its brilliance was it was very simple. It was straightforward. It was media friendly. And that led to a number of books, and they've given me a pointer, which is a laser pointer, which looks huge. I think it's from the 1980s, but anyway, I'll try not to point it into anyone's eyes, or we could have a major problem. A number of these books by people like Andrew Dixon White took the history of science and religion and recast it in the model of conflict, the warfare of science with Christendom. And this conflict hypothesis became extremely powerful. One of our colleagues in Durham, Professor Jeff Astley with Leslie Francis a number of years ago, looked at a number, this is from 2010, looked at attitudes among sixth formers within the UK. They asked them to comment on the statement, there is a fundamental conflict between scientific and religious claims. As you'll see, 62% of the sample agreed or strongly agreed with that. It's deeply embedded within many forms of and cultures of education within the UK, this conflict model. The trouble is that I don't think it quite works. It's too simplistic. If I may use an old illustration, what is a kiss? A kiss is the approach of two pairs of lips, the reciprocal transmission of carbon dioxide and microbes, and the juxtaposition of two orbicular muscles in a state of contraction. That's a kiss in scientific terms. But if I go to my wife and say, Alison, I'd love to get together with you for a mutual transmission of carbon dioxide and microbes, she would say, get lost. You see, in that context with my wife, the carbon dioxide and microbes are true, but they're not sufficient to fully talk about the nature of a kiss. One has to talk about meaning, value, purpose, love. Actually, both are true, but different. And the conflict model forces you into saying there is only one answer to this. And interesting enough, that conflict model was picked up not just by new atheists, but those at the completely opposite end of the theological spectrum, which is the rise of six-day creationism, particularly arising out of the culture wars in early 20th century America, the development of those who would read the first chapter of Genesis as a scientific text rather than a theological text. And just as New Atheism said that the real answer is in science, so six-day creationism said the real answer is in the text of Scripture as interpreted as we set out. And this led to a whole industry of scientific creationism, looking for scientific arguments to support a universe not 13.8 billion years old, but only 6,000 years old. The trouble with the conflict model, as I've said, doesn't allow that breadth of understanding of events, but it also denies something of the origins of science. And although this sometimes is overstated by historians from faith communities, I think there is a very interesting argument to say, why did science grow particularly within Europe and particularly in Christendom? And part of the argument there is to say there were a number of theological understandings of the world from the Judeo-Christian view that led to modern science. Because God was free to create, not following human logic, the way you had to do science was through telescopes, look at the universe. That was Galileo's motivation. It was Kepler's motivation to use observation to find out what God had actually done. Because God was a God of order, you should find regularities or laws. Because human beings were made in the image of God, there should be the possibility of understanding that order. Because there was belief in one God, there should be a universality of laws. And because there was no fear of the gods of nature, you weren't poking your nose into the realm of the gods. You actually could do experiments on it. Conflict model, I don't think really makes sense. The second problem with the secularization hypothesis is the myth of human progress. As the Vice-Chancellor rightly said, the turn of the century was full of belief in the power of science and technology to develop utopia, deliver utopia. In this recent book, How the Victorians Took Us to the Moon, Ewan Rhys-Moores talks about that Victorian optimism of the use of science. And a number of thinkers carried that on to say, the power of science and technology will deliver us. Let me go back to Gene Roddenberry in Star Trek. On the bridge of the Starship Enterprise, different peoples from different languages and cultures would come together in this common pursuit of the advancement of science. I mean, one or two problems with Klingons here and there, but apart from that, it would be all right. The myth of human progress puts a certain responsibility on science to deliver, which in the history of the 20th century, it has both delivered, but not always for the good. The wonderful advances in medical science are also the advances that led to the gas chambers of Auschwitz. The wonderful ways of building, enhancing the environment. The downside has also been the abuse of the environment. And this sense of trust in science, I think we're in a very interesting time at the moment. This is some work, and I'm sorry that these might be a little small, from work done in the States from 2016 to 2020. Far left-hand side of the screen, you see higher confidence in science amongst whites. But notice what's happening, particularly with Black communities in the middle of the screen. Those who are not too confident in science at all begins to rise. And part of this, I think, is a legacy of what science has done amongst Black communities for eugenics, medical experimentation amongst various groups in the US, and indeed many of our modern technologies which have an inherent racial discrimination within them. Images of faces, for example, preferentially pick up white faces far more effectively. This sense of whether you can trust in science has also been cultured, developed in the move from pre-modern through modern to post-modernity, and this distrust of experts. I had to put Michael Gove in there, hadn't I? So the secularization hypothesis, I think, falls because of the inadequacy of both the conflict model and the myth of human progress. But thirdly, it just doesn't fit with the data. The data is just far too complex for such an easy correlation to be found. First of all, what do we mean by religion? This is a plot from the Church of England, which shows the decrease in those attending worship on a Sunday up through 2015. You can see the decline here. And that led to a number of scholars talking about that was the church that was, in terms of the Church of England. But attendances at Sunday services in the Church of England are only a very small part of the religious landscape. Grace Davey, a distinguished sociologist at Exeter University, pointed out a number of things that may be happening in this. The first thing she argued was that we see a movement from belonging to believing. No longer do people want to identify or belong to communities in terms of church membership, but that doesn't mean that people don't still have interest or commitment to believing. As a number of people after the ONS survey showing the decline in Christian adherents, or those who would describe themselves Christian, pointed out that those describing themselves as no religion will stay, many of them will still pray regularly or believe in some form of transcendent reality. Grace also argued for the phenomenon of vicarious religion. What she meant by that was that people want religion done for them, even if they don't want to do it themselves. We are a culture which still wants places to be hatched, matched, and dispatched. We're still a culture where, in times of national tragedy, we want somewhere to go and pray. Vicarious religion is a really interesting phenomenon. I think it perhaps works more in the rural rather than urban setting, but I think there's questions around that. Grace Davey is one distinguished scholar. Elaine Graham at the University of Chester developed some of this argument to talk also about how we may be in a post-secular space. Elaine argued that there are those features in our society where there's persistent and widespread disillusion and skepticism towards religion, and objections to religion as a source of legitimate public discourse, but at the same time, renewed visibility of religion in public life and a corresponding acknowledgement of the importance of religious values and actors. Let me move on by talking about the data, and that is what we observe about UK religion in particular. One of our colleagues at Durham, David Goodhue, for a number of years, has collated in a series of volumes church growth, particularly looking at new churches, Pentecostal churches, ethnic churches, those which have grown in the last few decades. And it's a remarkable picture. This is an interesting plot from a retired mathematician called John Haywood. This shows different Christian groupings, and forgive me, throughout this talk, I'm going to veer towards Christian statistics and theology because that's my background. That's not to say that it's the most important, but it's just my background in terms of my knowledge. And it shows the rate of decline of a number of traditional denominations. And yet at the right-hand side of the picture, you see the growth in some of the new churches, Redeemed Church of God, Vineyard, New Frontiers. Dr. Haywood goes on, and I find this plot really helpful, on the basis of this, to predict when various churches will go out of business. Would you like to see it? Here we are. Those of you in the United Reformed Church, that's fairly close. The Methodist Church, of which I mean, if I can stay alive for another 20 years, I'm going to inherit the whole of the Methodist Church, all of the property. I'm going to be a multimillionaire if I can do that. Those of you from the Church of England, you need to live a little more longer. The Baptists and Open Brethren go, well, I mean, it's a wonderful kind of plot, but of course, it's far too simplistic because UK religious groups are deeply influenced by migration, by those coming into the country, and by seeing UK religion as part of the global context. And Grace Davey, in this book, Europe, the Exceptional Case, argued very strongly for this. She said that the secularization hypothesis doesn't work if you look at other cultures. If you go to South Korea, for example, where there's been a huge growth in science and technology, you see it alongside a huge growth, not just in Christian groups, but other faith communities. She argues that Europe is the exceptional case in terms of the decline that we've seen in traditional church groupings. And of course, on the world stage, you see a very religious groupings. I'm a Methodist. Europe is declining in the number of Methodists, but in Africa, the number of Methodists is doubling every 5 years. In Asia, the number of Methodists is doubling every 5 years. In South America, the number of Methodists is doubling every 5 years. North America, which already has about 10 million Methodists, is pretty flat, slightly declining. But the growth in world Christianity is something which is really quite significant. And alongside that, religion plays a part in global economics and politics. The war in Ukraine has to be understood in part as, or you need to understand a little bit about the Orthodox background and the split in the Orthodox Church, fueling some of the attitudes in terms of Russia and Ukraine. As we look at the American scene, particularly the reversal of Roe versus Wade, the influence of, I have to say, not just evangelical Christianity. Evangelical Christianity is often, the finger is pointed towards it, but also Roman Catholicism in the States. Extremely important. And as I will come back to in a moment, the role of religion in thinking about our care for the environment is both positive and negative. And then in terms of the data, let's also talk about scientists, because this is an interesting piece of work. What do scientists actually believe? Richard Dawkins is, and one or two others, are very keen on quoting this survey from 1998, appeared in Nature, a survey of scientists in the National Academy of Sciences. And the American public, 83% believe in God, but you notice here the very low percentages of mathematicians, physicists, astronomers, and biological scientists. Well, actually, if you increase the number to about 2,500 of the sample and you look in a little more detail, the Pew survey looked at the members of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And what you see is absolutely 83% of the general public, lower number of scientists compared to that. But those who believe in a higher power are 18%. Those who believe in neither are 41%. Slightly different. If you then break this down by age, and this is fascinating, those who are over 65 are far more skeptical about belief in God than those who are younger. Is new atheism tied to a particular generation? Would be an interesting question. And the person who has done perhaps the most long-term and extensive work on this is Elaine Howard-Eklund at Rice University. Elaine looked at 300 scientists at 21 elite universities and found a minority of scientists see religion and science as always in conflict. She then looked at various regions of the world, 8 regions of the world, did find that scientists were more secular than the general population, but in 4 regions, 50% of scientists see themselves as religious. I hope that this is all right so far and you're still with me, roughly. I've talked about new atheism and the secularization hypothesis. I've talked about some of the problems with that, the myth of conflict, the myth of human progress, and indeed some of the data, which is far more complex. In the final moments I've got left, can I go on and talk about perhaps some of the areas where I'm experiencing a really interesting and fruitful dialogue between science and theology? And I've called this really interesting big questions. It's extraordinary in 1987 when Stephen Hawking sold 10 million copies of A Brief History of Time, the kind of coffee table book which talks about everyday concepts such as 26-dimensional space and Riemannian geometry. And you think to yourself, why did this sell so much? Well, part of it is Professor Hawking's own personal story, extraordinary personal story. But I think part of it, as Carl Sagan said in his foreword to this book, this is a book about God, or perhaps about the absence of God. What we're seeing in popular science is an engaging with some of the bigger questions, not always negatively. Paul Davis, who used to work just down the road from us in Newcastle, in a number of books, rather impishly in 1985 suggested, in my opinion, science offers a surer path to God than religion. And he's been particularly interested in what he calls the Goldilocks enigma, the fact that the universe seems just right in terms of its laws and circumstances to make life possible. And I think as well, I'm struck always by this sense of awe that I encounter amongst fellow scientists. Now, don't get me wrong, those of you who are scientists will know that most of the time, science is tedious, boring, frustrating. It's about research councils who don't give you the money that you think you should have. It's about PhD students who don't do what you tell them to do. It's about peer-reviewed journals which don't see the brilliance of the work that you've done. And it's about going to a telescope to observe in the visible light and finding it's cloudy. That's the reality of science. But there are those moments that John Hapgood, the former Archbishop of York and himself a research chemist, used to call look at that moments, where just under the frustration and the complexity are those beautiful scientific laws, elegant, far more simple than you would ever imagine. It was interesting when Nature talked about some of the first images from the James Webb Space Telescope. It did so under astronomers are in awe. Well, most of the time we look at these pictures, but these are awe-inspiring. Where does this sense of awe come from? Well, I think for me, a number of questions are interesting in terms of the fruitful dialogue. The first is the origin of the laws of physics. Just a few years ago, I was walking through Durham before the pandemic, and a physicist came up to me with tears in his eyes and he hugged me. This doesn't happen a lot to me, and it doesn't happen in Durham, and it doesn't happen with fellow physicists. It was on the day of the announcement of the discovery of gravitational waves. You remember Einstein had said that the space-time of the universe is a bit like a stretchy fabric. And if you've got a large mass in it, it distorts the stretchy fabric. If you then get two black holes which collide into each other, there are little ripples in the stretchy fabric, the space-time of the universe, which move out across the universe. And Einstein said, and this will happen, and by the way, you won't see it. 100 years later, in this experiment, the Advanced LIGO, where you shoot a laser beam, sorry, that's the wrong pointer, this laser beam, you shoot a laser beam down that, bounce it across a mirror, one at 90 degrees, and you hope that if one of these little ripples moves through the Earth, you might see space being stretched, and we saw it. In fact, the space was stretched by an amount which is less the diameter of a proton. And that was seen, gravitational waves. Now, I had nothing to do with this experiment, and my fellow physicist had nothing to do with this experiment, but it was such a wonderful thing that 100 years ago, Einstein predicted this, and then we saw it. As Einstein said, one of the most incomprehensible things about the universe is that it's comprehensible. Why should that be? Where do the laws of physics themselves come from? And then, as Professor Frank, no doubt, at some length excited you about the end of the universe itself, because in 1999, the discovery that the universe was accelerating in its expansion was something we didn't expect at all. And the universe will expand forever. It may rip itself apart, but as it expands, it cools. As it cools, human life or any kind of life becomes very unlikely. This is very depressing. The futility of the future of the universe. Paul Davis wrote, an almost empty universe growing steadily more cold and dark for all eternity is profoundly depressing. Where does hope come from in this, in terms of the physical universe? Well, I think it's interesting that particularly within the Christian faith, the materiality of concepts such as bodily creation and bodily resurrection and new heaven and new earth open up some kind of dialogue to talk about hope in the face of futility. Just as in terms of human death, Christian theology has often tried to give hope in the face of futility. And then there's something about the supple and subtle universe which we live. Isaac Newton, during his lockdown of being sent home, came up with a whole number of things, differential equations, which generations of sixth formers have cursed him for ever since. But his laws of motion and gravity and the way that planets move around the sun, and in Victorian living rooms, you would buy orreries like this one, mechanical models which would tell you where the planets were in the past and where they are in the future. The universe under Newton was a mechanical universe. It was picturable and it was predictable. Of course, then at the beginning of the 20th century, quantum theory said it's nothing of the sort. The universe is unpredictable and it's unpicturable in lots of our everyday ways. That the universe at its smallest scale has uncertainty to it. And this bizarre thing for which these gentlemen got the Nobel Prize just a little while ago, it's entanglement or togetherness in separation. And if you've read the news today, colleagues at Sussex University are claiming that they're going to be using this type of thing for quantum computers. Now, this opens up a world which is very different from the world of Isaac Newton, where the mechanical universe, the clockwork universe, was one of the arguments against a God who had anything to do with the universe. After all, if it was a perfect clock, God couldn't poke his finger into the mechanism. God was separated out to become a deistic God. As John Polkinghorne and others have pointed out, a supple and subtle universe means there may be more to the universe and God's interaction with the universe than we thought. And then there's something here, I think, in terms of care for the environment. Sir John Horton, a great mentor and friend of mine, was one of the scientists who co-chaired the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the first report that really brought together 130 scientists from around the world, different countries, to point out just what we were doing with the environment. Horton was a brilliant atmospheric physicist. He was also involved in this work because of his religious faith. He believed that not only did you have to show the data of what was happening, you also had to change the will. How do you change human selfishness at heart? Fifth, and just about lastly, is something about being human. So what does it mean in a scientific world when neuroscience tells me about how my brain works and a tightening relationship of mind and brain? And in a world where at some point I'm going to have to ask my computer whether I can switch it off before I switch it off. The growth of intelligence and consciousness in artificial intelligence. And maybe one day when we discover not only the atmosphere that's possible for life around planets, but we see little green women and little green men waving at us. All of these questions were part of Darwin's interest in terms of, if we are part of an evolutionary history, what makes human beings different, if anything? And the question of what it means to be human seems to me to be the central question for the next 10 years. Christianity and other world religions have something to say about concepts such as community and love, the nature of what it means to be human. And so I'm really quite positive about not just the survival of religion, but actually the importance of religion as we go ahead. Just over a year ago, I found myself as part of a meeting at Washington National Cathedral. There they have a small vestry, and those of us on the panel assembled in the vestry before the panel discussion. I walked in to find Jeff Bezos with 6 of his PR people there. Avril Haines, head of US National Intelligence, was there with, I think, 3 spies, to be honest. R.V. Loeb, my friend and Harvard astrophysicist, was there with a Netflix fly-on-the-wall documentary crew who were following him around. Bill Nelson, the NASA administrator, was there by video, and I arrived with my coat. That was the only entourage that I had. But as part of that meeting, we talked about space exploration, we talked about space exploitation, we talked about our common love of Star Trek and science fiction, we talked about unidentified aerial phenomenon, UFOs perhaps, we talked about comets or artifacts moving through the solar system that might come from other worlds. And what interested me was that I was there as a theologian, invited to comment on this in the midst of the science, on the ethics and the theology and understanding what it means to be human. And some of the work that we're doing at Durham today is exactly about that. We have a big project called Equipping Christian Leadership in an Age of Science. Our aim is to help church leaders, particularly senior church leaders, encounter science, not with fear or with negativity or with silence, but with joy and humility and curiosity. And Vice Chancellor, that approach goes right back to our first professor of astronomy at Durham. Temple Chevalier was appointed in 1841. He was already professor of mathematics and reader of Hebrew at the time. He was very disappointed, actually, didn't get professor of theology. And in fact, we've got a letter from him where he says the person who was appointed lacked unction. That's quite an insult amongst theologians, by the way. Chevalier was a remarkable person. Not only was he professor of all of these things, he was registrar of the university, he was rural dean, he was residentiary canon. He was also, for over almost 40 years, rector of Esh Parish Church. You can still go to it on the hills outside of Durham. Chevalier was a brilliant astronomer. Sunspots, the crater on the moon is named after him. And he was a contemporary of Charles Darwin. They both read William Paley and Natural Theology at Cambridge University. They both had a child who died. You remember for Darwin, it was the death of Annie, his daughter, that was the real moment where Darwin moved away from Christian faith. If you go to Esh Parish Church, you see a tombstone for Chevalier's son, who died in childhood. And in 1830 or so, Chevalier gave the Halcyon lectures in Cambridge. He gave 20 lectures. The first 4 are on astronomy, and all he says is, wow, isn't this amazing? The next 4 is about the Bible and his understanding of the importance of how God speaks through scripture. And then, to be honest, after his first 8, he then does what many lecturers do and just uses old sermons and little bits of things that he couldn't publish anywhere else and fills up the other 12 lectures. But Chevalier was not trying to prove the existence of God through science. What he was doing in these lectures was saying, wow, let's have a conversation. How does this relate to revealed religion? And it seems to me that's not a bad place to stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David, for such a wide-ranging and thought-provoking lecture that covered so many facets of the relationship between religion and science. We do have a bit of time for questions, so I'm going to join David and sit down. We have a roving mic. We also have an opportunity for colleagues online to ask us questions through the Zoom chat. So let me come and join you. But I might, David, just take the privilege of the first question to ask something that I think is, in some ways, it's kind of 101, but it's an obvious point. But for most of us thinking about the secularization hypothesis and how that really accelerates with Newton and the early to middle phases of the Enlightenment, it really is about a shift from a concept of a human-centric universe in which whether it's a Christian faith or a variety of faiths, that personal relationship to God, that sense that human beings are at the center of how the universe has been conceived and created, to something which suddenly with Newton and beyond starts to look very different and de-centered. And I know it's a very obvious point, and it's an obvious feature of the secularization narrative. And I'm a scholar of the Enlightenment, and I agree with you. I think it's not a narrative to which we should simply subscribe. I think it's an artifact of a particular moment of the 19th century, actually. But nevertheless, I think that's how people would frame that in terms of something, the tension between a relationship between a view of the world with that relationship between the human and the divine at the center, and the picture of the world that physics gives us, which is something vast, impersonal, in which we are beyond insignificant.
It's not 101 at all, Vice Chancellor, if I may say. It's a very profound point, because what certain theological thinkers did was to associate relationship with place, that we were at the center of everything. What's interesting within other theological thinkers, and this is a very strong part of Christian theology, was the ability for a number of them to think about other worlds and life on other worlds. And in the 15th century, Nicholas of Cusa made a fundamental theological move where he said, specialness of relationship is not about place, it's about gift. So Cusa said that human beings are important not because we're at the center of everything, but we're given the gift of relationship with God. But that gift is not exclusive. It's not only for human beings. So the divine is in relationship, not just with human beings, but could be in relationship with those on other worlds. And so from Basil, one of the early church fathers, right through to some of the pioneers of modern astronomy, Christian Huygens, Richard Bentley, and others, this openness to other worlds gave them this sense that God's purposes, or the purposes of the universe, are far more than just human beings. And I think there's always been that tension within particularly Christian theology between human beings as the center and the only, with this sense of human beings as special on the basis of gift, but not being the only ones.
That's very interesting, and that's also something about the religious origins of science fiction.
Yes, absolutely, that's right.
We'll open the floor for questions, and perhaps take one from the floor to start with, if anyone would like to raise their hand.
Hi, Tim Bradshaw,
Tim.
from the Russell Group. Your perception on Star Trek's interesting, because it must have been a very interesting discussion between Rick Berman and Gene Roddenberry when they had Star Trek: The Next Generation, with the Q being that's quite clearly a godlike, irascible creature throughout that series. But anyway, that's beside the point. Your perspective is obviously from the West and from Christianity, and I was just thinking about whether there is historical evidence for differences of opinion challenge between religion and science back in time and also around the world. So obviously, China, for example, maybe 1,000 years ago, Byzantium, places like that beforehand, where science was evolving and becoming very, very important. Because we shouldn't think of the West as being the origin of some of these things. Some of these things happened in India, the Middle East, China, and elsewhere. Is there any historical evidence of conflict between religion and science in those places and times?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I think this is slightly beyond my area of expertise. So really I should say I don't really know, but let me prattle on just for a moment or two on this. You're absolutely right to say, and that's why I think it's sometimes overstated, the Judeo-Christian seedbed of modern science, because you've got a whole number of things, tributaries feeding into the river of modern science. Chinese, Greek, Islamic scholars all feeding in. What's interesting, if you go back to the Babylonians were really terrific observers. So we know that they saw Halley's Comet. One of our Durham colleagues, Richard Stevenson, a number of years ago, found cuneiform tablets in the British Museum from the Babylonians. noting Halley's Comet, and we can use their observation. Well, he uses observations from China, from Babylon, and others to actually do some science with. What was interesting about Babylonian culture was that the observations didn't seem to connect with the mythology or the basic understanding of how the world was. The two were held perhaps in separation, independence. Now, I think what we've got is probably a whole series of relationships in different cultures at different times. And John Brooke, great historian of science and religion, talks about the relationships of science and religion. Ian Barber put them in a fourfold typology, where he said, if you look at any particular culture or any particular time, you've got types of conflict going on. You do see conflict. You see independence, which is the Babylonians separating the two. It was a strategy of Stephen Jay Gould, by the way, to try and take creationism out of the classroom in the US, talk about independence. You've got dialogue going on, which is much messier. And you've got moments where you've got integration, trying to lock the two together, although always you've got is science or religion the one in authority for doing that. And I think you see all of those relationships. You certainly see them within Christianity. I think there are particular elements of science that have appealed to particular religious outlooks. I worked for a number of months, in Bombay, but worked for a number of years with a colleague, Narayan Chandra Rana, an Indian astrophysicist. We worked very much in the early days of dark matter, Richard, and whether the universe would be closed or not with the amount of dark matter. And Rana wanted the universe to be closed and for it to bounce after a big crunch. And I said to him, why? And he said, well, basically, I like the image of reincarnation. It's fair enough. I mean, this is the way that religious culture interacts with observations. And in more modern thinking, in the kind of popularized work of Fritjof Capra, Gary Zukov, you get a number of authors beginning to talk about the togetherness and separation of quantum theory, resonating with Eastern religions. So I think it's a very rich question, and actually there is interaction going there, but it's difficult to characterize it in just one mode. A whole number of things going on.
Thank you. We had a question here.
Leonard Anderson, ex-Grey College. Sort of related, but what have you got to say about the multi-faith religions where you're worshipping many gods, right? For the sun and the moon and the earth, and, obviously not hereabouts, and, and the ideas of reincarnation, which you've already mentioned. I mean, are there some insurance policies for the afterlife? And what do you think about reincarnation?
Wow, gosh. I think it's a fair question. It probably is a series of lectures, at least 20 like Temple Chevalier. And part of it is I don't want to reduce a particular understanding of one faith community to finding commonalities between them. So for instance, I got to know a little bit about Hinduism. Hinduism itself has many different streams, from those who would believe in a divinity to those who wouldn't. So it's quite a complex faith community in itself. Now, in terms of reincarnation, I'm not sure at all, to be honest. Christian theology talks about resurrection, which is not about the re-inhabiting of this physical world in a spiritual reincarnation, but actually the movement from this creation to a new creation, a new heaven and earth. And the concept of resurrection for Christians sounds at times a bit like reincarnation, but actually isn't. So there's real differences between faith communities on some of this. I like your insurance policy for future life, but I think I better probably leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Rachel, should we take a question from the Zoom chat? Would you mind reading one out for us? Thank you.
Okay, so Sarah has a question, which is, which scientific discovery, recent or ancient, has most excited you in its revelation of the character and nature of God?
Wow. I think that hugging by a fellow physicist on the streets of Durham and the discovery of gravitational waves, because, I mean, not only is that discovery significant in terms of pushing our knowledge of the early universe back further than a lot of our observations perhaps can do, but also that sense of just seeing the universality of laws, that the same laws that govern why my golf shot comes down back to Earth are the same laws that apply round about black holes, millions of light years away from us. And also that this is something which is way out of our everyday common sense ability to imagine. There's something about that. Now, I have to say in this, that doesn't make me go in the middle of the street being hugged by a fellow Durham physicist, gosh, God. Because I don't think you can go from that kind of scientific discovery to those classic arguments for the existence of God, the design argument that became very popular. But I do think with Temple Chevalier, I go wow at it. And from the perspective of Christian faith, which says that God has spoken in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, then that can be interpreted from that perspective as reflecting God. So these scientific discoveries might be pointers to a deeper story to the universe. That's what Paul Davis says about Goldilocks enigma, that they may be pointers, but they're certainly not proofs. But for the person who already, in a sense, has some sense of God, it resonates with a belief in that kind of God.
Thank you. Question here.
Thank you very much, David. It was great. Going back to your first point about correlation and causation, I wondered, and it's maybe not fair to ask you this,
Yes.
but in terms of Europe being an exception regarding science, the progress of science and the decline of belief in God, I wondered if you had an idea about what might be a causation rather than a non-causal correlation, in terms of, is it to do with economic wealth or something? You know, I wondered if you did have an idea of why Europe is an exception. Thank you.
You're very welcome and fair to ask that. I mean, it's an obvious question. Thank you for it. And my answer would be, I think there's a whole number of factors going on, none of which are sole causation in themselves, just as probably with the extinction of species, there is not just one factor going on. I think, as the Vice-Chancellor has already referred to, there is that legacy of intellectual history, which comes from a whole number of thinkers, forming a seedbed of thought which moves away from belief of God's involvement in the everyday, or even the concept of God. I think there's the movement in the 19th century where a number of religious thinkers had basically put their insurance policy into the design argument, and then Darwin comes along and undercuts that completely. At which point, because they've not taken biblical revelation seriously enough, the whole thing crumbles for them. I think there's the trauma of the post-Darwinian controversies played out in the public arena. I think there's also the question of a culture reacting against the power of Christianity, or the role that Christianity inhabited in a power structure within the country, and a reaction against that. I think there's also something about the insularity or inward-looking nature of particular Christian communities. and the sense of a siege mentality in many. So I think there's a whole number of reasons going on there. And I think, I mean, one has to be really careful with this. So you'll read in a number of history books, well, post-Second World War, there was a decline in religious observance. That's not quite the case. It's a bit more complicated than that. And you then get patterns of migration, numbers coming into faith communities in different ways. So I think it's really important to keep asking what the cause is, but there's a whole number of factors there. And I've just picked on a few of them as bullet points. There's probably a whole number of others going.
Thank you. Question over there.
Bill Walker. Yes, I loved your description of the secularization hypothesis, and I've thought for many years that people who think that science and religion are in conflict probably know very little of either of those things. But the question is, given that that's a belief that's out there in popular culture at the moment, is there anything we should be doing to overturn it, or do you think it will just die out of its own accord? Is there more perhaps that Durham can do?
Yeah, thank you. Leslie Francis, a number of years ago, from some of the interviews that he was doing with young people, suggested three things which I think are actually really helpful. The first is the importance of teaching history and philosophy of science alongside science. And that's really quite difficult in terms of a very packed science curriculum at school, because you've got to get through so much of it. But there is evidence to say that if you teach history and philosophy of science alongside the science, integrated with the science, less young people drop out of science. It keeps them interested in science for longer. That's the first thing. I think the second thing, where Durham is particularly good, may I say, I would say that, of course, is what Francis argued for, the importance of interdisciplinary conversation, both in schools and in higher education. Because of C.P. Snow's two cultures, the way that young people often will simply study arts and humanities or science means that we lose that relational conversation, which is at the heart, I think, of what a university is about. Within the colleges, of course, we have the opportunity for that interdisciplinary conversation. That's why they're so important for me. But also, I think Durham as a human scale university means that we can simply walk from the theology department over to the physics department. I mean, over the river, using a bridge, of course, but I mean, over the river. And that sense of Durham's tradition of interdisciplinarity is very important. Now, I think that's something that we sometimes take for granted, but is very, very important. So how you assess research output often isn't the best at looking at interdisciplinarity. So that's the second thing. Now, the third thing is for those of you who are part of churches. And Francis pointed out that many of the young people that have been talking to, who fell into an understanding of the world in terms of scientism, that science has the only answer, many of them came from religious backgrounds where they did not hear science affirmed as a gift within their churches. So a recent Pew survey said that amongst American Christian young people, around about 65% want to work in science and technology. Less than 5% had ever heard their pastor or youth worker ever talk about science. And that sense of engaging with science, affirming science. We've done a research project with interviewing about 50 bishops and equivalent leaders in the church. And sometimes it was quite difficult to get them to agree to be interviewed on their attitudes to science. One of our young researchers went to a bishop's study and she said, "Thank you very much, Bishop, for agreeing to be interviewed on your attitude to science." His face fell. He said, "Science," he said. "My secretary told me that this was an interview about silence." And then he paused for a moment and he said, if I'd known it was about science, I wouldn't have agreed. Now, why, actually? That's about fear and negativity. So there's something on the part of faith communities, particularly I can speak from church communities, which actually expressly, intentionally talks about science as gift. As Kepler said, science is thinking God's thoughts after him, and that's a delight. So those things, I think.
Thank you. He doesn't walk on water. I have a. If it's all right, Rachel, I'll take one further question from the Zoom chat. From our
Okay, this is a question from Dominic Turner. To what extent do you think the so-called declining Christian belief is being replaced with a faith and a belief in the ability of science and AI, regardless of how possible it actually is? For example, the belief that the large language models such as ChatGPT will become conscious.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, Dom is one of our former students and is now doing a master's at Cambridge in artificial intelligence and some of the ethics around that. So I'm tempted to say he needs to answer that question more than me. I think this whole area is fascinating, isn't it? The Sunday program on Radio 4 asked ChatGPT to write a sermon, a 60-minute sermon. It was far better than most of the sermons that I preach, it has to be said. I think there's a difference between power of collating information, and that's a wonderful gift that AI gives us. A wonderful way of doing the calculations, both for our understanding of the universe and our working with the universe. But there are certain things that, Nick Cave, singer, said that ChatGPT will never write a good song because it's never suffered. That's a really interesting kind of observation. And if you know Nick Cave's own story, you'll know just how much his music comes out of that experience of suffering. There are certain things, I think, which are relational at heart, rather than just about powers of intelligence. Now, whether at some point, I'm not worried about AI in terms of, I don't find it a threat. But Don went on to say our trust in. And the problem is that how do we trust something that we don't fully understand? And that's always, I think, a problem in terms of the popularization of science. Why are we so worried at times in the public arena about nuclear power? I think part of it is we can't visualize it in the same way that we can sometimes visualize other forms of energy. So these are questions, I think, for the popularization of science, and they're often to do with the narratives or the stories that we tell, rather than just the facts. But at the end of his master's, Dom, I'm sure, will be able to tell us all what it's all about.
We've got time for one further question. Yes, you had your hand up. Sorry that we can't get through all the questions, but we'll have
Don't you worry, Dave. This is a very short one. So Luke March, Durham graduate. And my question is really quite simple and more up to date in a sense. When I received my COVID vaccine in a cathedral, and I know that many cathedrals and churches were involved in this, did that affect the balance between science and religion?
It's a short question with a very, very long answer, or response at least. I think the whole pandemic was fascinating on a number of levels. I think the language of being led by the science, what do we mean by that? Because actually it gave the impression of science as a monolith. Science is done by scientists, and the sense that sometimes scientists disagree. So there was something about our understanding of the nature of science. I think then the role of church leaders, and I've got a postdoc who's working on this at the moment, Toko Kamwendo, wonderful piece of research, really looking at the role of how church leaders became apologists for government policy. Now, there's nothing wrong in that in terms of, when a society is facing existential threat, then actually you see this in world wars as well. But how do faith community leaders become both affirming, but also critiquing. That's not an easy thing to do. And then we saw the low take-up of vaccinations in certain ethnic groups. We were particularly concerned about working with Black majority churches and their church leaders to help them think through with their communities just the importance of the vaccine. But that sense which you got of churches being open as places for healing, well, Francis Bacon, a long time ago, would have been very happy with that, because Bacon saw science as, in some way, a gift to help in the midst of a fallen community. Didn't think it would provide salvation, but he saw something about ameliorating the effects of the fall. So I think that's fascinating. Those would be the kind of bullet points that I'd want to tease out. And yeah, thank you.
I think that's a great note to end on, and the wonderful image of vaccination in the cathedral is a great encapsulation of what we've been talking about today. We can continue the conversation in the Rennie room, which is just outside. We offer you a drink and something to eat because it's nearly 8 o'clock, and if you haven't eaten already, you may well want to. So please do come and join us afterwards, and we'd love to continue the conversation. But may I just thank the Institution of Civil Engineers. It's been really lovely to be here. It's a great location in the heart of London and the heart of everything that we do in this country. And David, it's been a wonderful and wide-ranging conversation and Q&A. So thank you again, David.